The colonial period had a profound effect on the Kenyan cuisines. The Eastern African coast has been in touch with many other continents, especially Asia.
The question which you should have, sort of asked from the beginning is, if food is cultural and food is political, then how does that politically reflect on my plate?
The system was really deeply rooted in our education system. Our education system was only about cash crops.
Food is one of those aspects of a society that is very political, in terms of who gets to produce, who gets to buy it, who gets to benefit, both in terms of the farmers.
The sad thing is, since the advent of colonialism, many of these have not really been given their due chance of further development.
You're listening to the Chakula Podcast.
You're listening to the Chakula Podcast, a podcast of the Root to Food Initiative. The Root to Food Initiative is a publicly funded program of the Heinrich Paul Stiftung in Nairobi, Kenya. The Root to Food Initiative promotes the realization of the human right to food in Kenya by proposing agroecology as a solution. On this podcast, we bring to you relevant issues on food and farming systems in Kenya and beyond. We break down topics and dig deeper into day-to-day happenings on our food and farming systems, giving a holistic view on the food we eat. Food is an integral part of Kenyan culture, representing a rich tapestry of traditions and heritage. In Kenya, food is not merely for sustenance. It holds immense social and cultural significance. Different communities have their different cuisines, preparation techniques, and food-related rituals that have been passed down through generations. I'm your host, Felistes Mwalia. And today, we have two esteemed guests joining us for a reflective, yet also a very interesting discussion on how colonialism shaped our culinary and dietary habits in Kenya. We are delighted to have Dr. Maundu. He works for the National Museums of Kenya. And I also have Darius Okolla, who's a curator at the Elephant. Karibu sana to the show, Dr. Maundu.
Thanks, and thanks for having me.
And karibu sana to the show, Darius.
Thank you for having me.
Are you excited to talk about food, knowing the fact that food is at the center of everything and how our culture, how our food cultures have been able to change due to colonization?
Definitely. I mean, it is in the morning. Sure, food is an integral part of how we all want to start our day and how we carry out the various aspects that food occupies in our daily lives. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
And I think just to start, Darius, did you have breakfast? Because you said that it's in the morning, and of course, food is. And what did you have for breakfast?
Yes, I did. I grabbed a cup of tea because I was in a bit of a rush. So I just grabbed a cup of tea and I was on my way.
Okay, so you didn't have like manduma, mangwashi?
I should have made some.
Okay, it's fine. I think to kick things off, let's delve into the topic. And I think, Darius, to start us off, in your assessment, how has colonial experience shaped our food cultures and its specific impact basically to the traditional food systems in Kenya?
I think one of the key elements that we noticed when we started doing the food series annually that you had mentioned earlier is the fact that there is a lot that whatever is on your particular plate says about where you are, what you are doing, in terms of class conversations, in terms of what you're producing, as a community, as individually. It matters of preferences in terms of what you'd want to eat. So food is one of those aspects of a society that is very political, in terms of who gets to produce, who gets to buy it, who gets to benefit, both in terms of the farmers, what gets to be available within particular locales. And so food is a very, very political experience. Any random a plate of food tells you a lot about where you are. it's also cultural. And in terms of culture, we talk about matters to do, for example, what are the habits of particular people. Culture is usually defined as man's attempt to try and find a coherent set of answers to the questions that plague him or her at whatever point they're in. And part of that, of course, is how they're able to feed their people. And how they're able to feed their people includes the seed preservation. Where do they get the seeds? What gets to grow where you are? And who got to bring what at what point in history? Did your interaction with other communities or other regions, what kind of interaction was it? Was these food experiences forced upon you? So there is a lot that goes on a simple plate of food on a table. Okay. And to link it particularly to the colonial experience, is the fact that you look through our historical dynamics and you realize, as Kenyans in particular, is that there's a lot of foods that were brought on, and for one reason or another, they caught on in terms of our experiences. Do we, for example, take maize and beans? What does it serve? Some of the food wars that you see on social media platforms. And in some of the ways, for example, we got to outlaw, or rather, the colonial experience outlawed, including aspects like traditional brews, and you look at the irony of the fact that it was framed as a moral conversation. They say, don't take this, don't take that, it's wrong. But it's the same people who are telling you that were importing and introducing local communities into their foreign brews, And so you see this sort of moralization of some of these conversations around food. You see, for example, introduction of maize and beans because it was looked at as, provide more energy for people to work in the farms. And it was easy to mass produce. So it becomes the food that is preferred among the people.
Thank you so much, Darius, for starting off the conversation. You've clearly started the conversation on a high note. And I definitely know Dr. Maundu has so much to share with us. And I didn't mention at the beginning, but Dr. Maundu, he's joining us via Zoom. So I'll also just let himself introduce himself, tell us more on what he does while also contributing to the discussion.
Thanks. My name is Patrick Maundu, as I was introduced, and I work for the National Museums of Kenya. I've worked for the National Museums of Kenya for over 30 years now. I am professionally an ethnobotanist. That means I study plants and how plants relate to people, but also I've extended my studies to what we refer to as indigenous knowledge. And so I'm within the National Museums of Kenya. I'm in a center known as the Kenya Resource Center for Indigenous Knowledge. I've worked a lot in Kenya, almost every part of this country, but also worked a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, within the CGIR sort of institutions. And so I would say my experience covers quite a lot of the cultures we find in sub-Saharan Africa. The colonial period had a profound effect on the Kenyan cuisines. Kenya, of course, is in the eastern part of the continent, and the Eastern African coast has been in touch with many other continents, especially Asia, Middle East, of course, and Europe, especially the southern part, the Mediterranean part of Europe, has been in contact with the East African coast for a very, very long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so that has been the entry point of many of the crops that we now use that have an Asian origin. Some of the crops, of course, like the banana, have been around since in antiquity, and because they've been here for so long, they are part of our culture. And in fact, some of the varieties, that some of the cultivars have been developed locally, far, far away from their place of origin, which is South Asia. We have many others which have come and have been here for very long, like taro, it's taro, which in Kenya we call nduma, or sometimes arrowroot, also came from South Asia long, long time ago. It's part of our food culture now. Sugarcane, we make beer, liquor from sugarcane, other than just the recent development of making sugar out of sugarcane. Locally, traditionally, it was an important part in the beer making process. And then, of course, there are others like the other crops that also came from distant places long time ago in South America, like the potato, sweet potato, and also the cassava. Those are important traditional foods of the country. But then we call those traditional because they are now part of our culture. We have developed new methods of making them, cooking them, despite the fact that they came from distant lands. But we also have crops that have been here in Africa since time immemorial, which were developed within the continent. A very good example is sorghum, for example. Sorghum was first domesticated in the continent in the area around Chad. We also have pearl millet, which also is an important crop, especially among the Bantu. That was first domesticated in Africa in the region around Mauritania a long time ago. And it's one of the crops that actually, as the Bantus migrated from Cameroon, and the border with Nigeria, they migrated with this crop. So it's a very old crop, over 4,000 or 5,000 years old. Then, of course, others many people may not connect it to Africa. Sesame is an African crop. Watermelon, the one we enjoy very much, was first also domesticated in the continent. Something like lablab bean, the one we call njahe, that's a very local bean, domesticated first in the area around Lake Victoria and Ethiopia. And then we have others like the cowpea, or the pea, has also been an important crop in the continent. So there are all these. Another one, lablab bean, has also its roots in the continent. So there are many others. Many of these important cereals, important legumes, now widely used worldwide, that have their origins can be traced to the continent. So it's so that the continent has offered a lot to the rest of the world in terms of cereals and also legumes and also vegetables. It has also offered a lot. But now the sad thing is since the advent of colonialism, many of these have not really been given their due chance of further development in research and also in extension. They are just the way they are, even just the way they are. They were even before colonialism. Many of them have not really been advanced. The biggest impact that the colonial period or the colonialists had on our food systems is that of the attitude they put on the African mind, that their foods were not good enough. I think that is the root cause of many of the problems that many of the communities in the country are facing now, because of that attitude towards their food. the attitude is that what is local is not good enough. And that's an attitude that started during the colonial days. There is a lot of history that there are many things that sort of contributed to that. Maybe it's not enough for this interview. If I can mention a few, one is the fact that some of the policies were not supportive of African foods. If I can give a very good example, is our local brews were food. Where our local brews, like what we call busa, is actually food, despite the fact that it has a little bit of alcohol in it. It was food, and because it was in competition with probably the more commercialized beers, it was outlawed. And even after independence, many of these liquors, many of these local brews were outlawed. They were branded the term illicit brews. Despite the fact that, like in the case of Eastern Province, much of that was prepared from specific types of sugarcane or honey, and so they were very healthy. And it's those brews that were also used in ceremonies, especially when you are blessing, when you are in marriage, when you are offering sacrifices for rain, in sacred places. Those are the things which were used, and those were part and parcel of the culture of the society. But then here comes the colonialists and also the governments that followed. They branded all that illicit brews. And so the local people found themselves in a fix, because this is something which is food, it's part of their culture. Some of the ceremonies cannot go without it. And now they find themselves in this. The other thing is many of the food preparations also involve herbal plants. For example, in the Maasai case, Maasai like soup, and soup is not taken without herbs. Herbs can be roots, can be bark, can be cuttings of stem, and these are put in soup, and then they are boiled with the soup. One as prophylaxis to guard them against certain diseases, common diseases, which are common among the Maasai. And Maasai, I'm just taking Maasai as an example. This is spread along many communities. So these herbs are put in soup, boiled together, and they fortify themselves with those herbs. It gives them immunity against common diseases. But then remember the 1925 act that outlawed herbal remedies and termed them, bundled them together with witchcraft. So it's within the Witchcraft Act. And that is a law that has survived all that time up to now, or very recently, when people have now tried to sort of review it, repeal it. So you see, even after colonialism, the governments that came after colonialism didn't really do much to address some of the issues that the colonial governments, some of the problems the colonial governments brought about. So, and it's not that alone. There are many other examples. For example, let's talk about seeds. Seeds are a very good example. Our mothers, our people, our local people have been exchanging seeds. I mean, since time immemorial. It's not bad to take. It was usual to take your seeds to the market and exchange them for something like other types of food or other types of seeds. That was very common. It's also common to go to your neighbor, get seeds from your neighbor. But now it's also perturbing to know that that whole area of seed exchange and seeds changing hands, the seed system has also not favored the local people. It has leaned a lot towards, it has favored the commercial companies, if I can say that. So the local person that has not really benefited from any of these laws, because exchanging seeds, buying seeds, which are not in quotes certified, is actually illegal in the country. So that has also been a legacy that was also from the colonial days, and it has not been addressed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Maundu, for the insights. And Darius, over to you. I know before the session we talked about how some crops have actually evolved, and it's quite interesting that Dr. Maundu has also mentioned the introduction of some of the crops that were introduced in the country even before colonization. But Darius, since you've been part of the Elephant, you've also published quite several articles on how some food crops like maize, how they ended up being like part of our diets. Perhaps you could just expound more on how this ended up being part of our diet.
What happens is, once there's this land grab that we witness, I mean, as a country, we were a settler colony. So once they introduced all these large-scale farming on what we used to call the White Islands, a problematic term, but for the purposes of the conversation, then they needed workers. But then we were not a cash economy. We were largely a subsistence economy, and communities would do their own barter trade. So in a way to get people to participate in the cash economy, of course, introduce the taxes, the heart tax, the breast tax, and all these taxes.
Probably you could also expound on that.
And when you introduce these taxes, people have to find a way to pay. But the only way they can pay is to be able to integrate themselves into the cash economy. The only way they can do that is to work on these islands. And the only way to get them to work for long is to provide them with the kinds of food that you think can sustain them to work throughout the day. And so that's how you end up with some of these foods introduced into our culinary culture. And
basically, I read an article on the Elephant written by Joe, where he also said that the fact that we enjoy maize and how ugali became our staple food is basically from what you've been able to explain right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think, Darius, that takes me to the next question on the introduction of cash crops actually and plantation agriculture during colonialism. How did it affect the availability and consumption of traditional foods?
There are a number of ways that shapes what goes on. One of them is you end up with this competition between cash crops and food crops in terms of people want to plant sugarcane, or they want to plant coffee, or they want to plant tea.
Yeah.
And when they're doing that, what happens is they end up, the acreage under food crop reduces. So in the pursuit of trying to make money out of the agricultural experiences by planting cash crops, then you're reducing the availability of land for food crops, for the everyday food crops. And it's something we witnessed up to now. You go to places like Mumias in Western Kenya, parts of central Kenya, some of the coffee areas, you see that people have tea or sugarcane or coffee in their farms, but there's a certain hidden poverty because you do not have enough food supplies to last a year. So what happens is, and some of these crops, they don't get paid immediately. So unless, if you're doing 2 or 3 harvesting seasons in a year, and something like sugarcane is almost 18 months.
Yeah.
And for those 18 months, you literally seeing this hidden poverty within, and especially within the rural communities where people do not have enough food to eat, yet there's a lot of stuff on the farm. So it becomes one of those legacies of people trying to make money, but then the irony of it is that they're starving while at it.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because even at the moment we see the government really supporting like coffee farmers, tea farmers, but they they always end up forgetting like the small scale farmers who focus so much on our food crops.
Yeah.
But anyway, at the end of the day, they're trying to make money, but.
And of course, there's the conversations around farm prices. There's conversations around yield. There's conversations around then once you've developed, this cash crop experience.
Mm-hmm.
What the next level of that, of course, given the market inefficiencies within our communities and a lot of, looking at the some of the researchers in our food, the whole food series, is that cartels begin to develop.
Yeah.
So market access becomes a problem. So along the way, there's even inefficiencies in terms of this farmer with the newly introduced crops trying to access the market, trying to access good prices. And so it creates, sort of these spiraling problems along the continuum. And in the end, these cash crops introduced are not able to, provide the kind of yield that would offset what they're losing by essentially giving up that land from food crops.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, quite intense, Darius. I think now we'll go back to the cultural aspect and how has it basically evolved over time?
I mean, it's what you see. It depends again with the communities, because one of the positive aspects of this is the fact that we're doing a lot of increasing research on our food experiences as countries, as a region. There's a lot of papers on these conversations. There's a lot of consortium of local organizations that are dealing with looking into what is the optimal food experiences for our people. And, based on regions, based on class, we're having conversation about what really is on your plate and how did we come about that. We're having conversations around, is it even viable anymore to keep, coffee? And we're seeing people, somewhere, uprooting them and saying, this thing is not giving me what we needed, whether it's cash or, sustainability for my farm. And so you begin to see that aspect of people begin to ask themselves the question which you should have, sort of asked from the beginning is, if food is cultural and food is political, then how does that politically reflect on my plate?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if some of the experiences we picked, and there are quite a number we've already mentioned, some of them being problematic and some of them being consequential, then how do we begin to work backwards and, correct some of those problems? And there's a lot of robust work done around that. Some of those experiences include the fact that we are seeing more, even within towns, we are seeing urban eateries that have a certain ethnic bent to them. We're seeing a lot more health consciousness among people saying, I'm not sure I should be taking this. I'm not sure I should be taking that. I'm not sure I would want to have this, as part of, my culinary experience. What I put on my plate, what I buy.
But I feel I feel there's also a compromise, Darius, because at the end of the day, in as much as, yes, there are all these restaurants coming up in terms of like trying to bring back our indigenous food, but when you go there, a normal person can't be able to afford that food. Definitely. And you go back, and you go back and ask yourself, actually, this is what we had, this is what you're pushing for, this is our local food, this is our indigenous food, and yet most of us can't afford that local food and that indigenous food as we talk right now. Because at the moment, it has been made to be like this cool. I don't know, it's like, it's also associated actually with class, because you find that even, say if you go to each restaurant, for instance, how many organic restaurants do we have in Nairobi? We have, there's one in Karen, what's the name? Cultiva.
Yeah.
Can I go there like to have like a proper meal and be full? A kawaida Kenyan? No.
Yeah.
In CBD, we also have a restaurant, an organic restaurant. It's called, I think, the Bridges. Yeah. Is it also very pocket friendly?
A lot of them are not, by the experiences of everyday shopping, especially in a country like ours where the incomes are not that high enough to sustain that kind of consumption. But then that exoticization of our foods is, so one facet of the problem. I think the bigger picture of it is the fact that people are having these conversations. And so one of the things that we lost again from the earlier conversation about cash crops is the fact that, to be able to sustainably and cheaply produce these foods, then you need to put certain systems behind them.
Yeah.
Cooperatives, research, you need a lot of political goodwill from, the state functionaries and the state agencies responsible for our food experiences. And so when you put all that together, the reason what we take commonly like maize can be affordably done, relatively speaking, is because there's these sort of structures put behind it, in terms of the logistics of importation or local production and all that. And you need that behind all the other food that, we consider our own. It's the only way then we can be able to, whether it's through subsidies from the state on the production systems, storage facilities, the researchers around it, then you are able to create the economies of scale in both production, storage, distribution, supplies, that then ensures the prices come down.
Dr. Maundu, do you have anything else to add on the conversation on introduction of cash crops?
Okay, thanks. The colonial government promoted the cash crops a lot.
Yeah.
Perhaps to support industries that were located elsewhere, especially in Europe and elsewhere. And so they encourage cash crops like tea, coffee, cotton, sugarcane, and of course, a lot of land was converted to what we can call now plantations of these crops. After independence, the governments that took over after independence sort of continued with the same notion that cash crops were the main thing they needed to promote, because they brought hard currency, as they were saying that time, not knowing that the system was really deeply rooted. It was in our education system. Our education system was only about cash crops.
Yeah.
And anything that is traditional, like traditional leafy vegetables, some of these crops we are talking about, root crops like sweet potatoes, manioc or cassava, did not feature much in our education system. So, for example, myself, when I was growing up, much of what I read in the textbooks was about these cash crops.
Yeah.
So, and again, the new governments, after taking over from the colonial government, took a lot of time to repeal or to review this educational material, so that they can reflect the real situation in their country, in their new country. And not only that, even in research, research, a lot of research went into those high value exportable crops. It's only recently now, when people are now looking inwards, when people have started now focusing research work on these, what we call neglected and unutilized crops.
Yeah.
So it's everywhere, in every aspect. Even in restaurants, you go, you never see these traditional crops. Again, it's only recently, if you remember, like 10, 15 years ago, when you have started seeing duma in the restaurants. Before then, it was much of it was wheat products or things that are European or Western in nature.
Yeah.
Because of that attitude that the local foods didn't really matter. And if you are seen eating local foods, for example, in a 5-star hotel, it's like you are a bit backward.
Yeah.
It was out of place. And even today, many of these restaurants, they still have that legacy. And that it may take a bit of time, but I think it will come at some point when they'll realize that we need also to consider local foods, which are really nutritious, and that's what local people want.
Yeah.
And even people from outside, they want this. They don't want to see the same thing. They are seeing elsewhere.
Dr. Maundu, still on the cash crops discussion, I know you, me, and Darius have an understanding on the impacts that the cash crops have to our food and farming systems and also just farmer livelihoods. Perhaps you could just expound more to our listeners what the impacts are of the cash crops.
Yes, cash crops are good. But I want to pick a few examples.
Yes.
Just to demonstrate what I mean. Take an example of sugarcane growing in Kenya, where farmers' land is plowed by a company. They plant sugarcane, and for the next 18 months or 2 years, that farm is completely held by sugarcane. You have nowhere else to grow anything else other than sugarcane. Now, what effect does that have? Your whole farm is planted with sugarcane completely. After 18 months, of course, you'll take that sugarcane, or it will be burned, cut, and then taken to the mill, and you'll get your bonus or your cash. But a few things may happen. One, in terms of food security, that household is food insecure.
Yeah.
And we have seen that, and we have conducted surveys and research and found that families or households that grow sugarcane in Western Kenya are less secure in terms of food, are less resilient as compared with families that grow other crops, diverse crops. Because when you grow diverse crops, of course, you have an opportunity to meet all the nutrients, the needs of the household as far as nutrients are concerned. Not the same when you grow sugarcane. Of course, one may argue that, but when I get the money, I can buy all these things. It's not the same. It's not the same. When you have something in your farm, then the chances are that you'll consume that. And I've seen many farmers in Western Kenya. Some of them, especially Vihiga, their farms can be really, really diverse. And diversity is good because if your farm is really diverse, you have something that comes up almost every season or every month. You have something to eat. As opposed to somebody who has just a few things or one thing, they have to wait for when it comes into season, just 1 month in 12 months. So diversity is good, and monocropping or growing food only for cash, those are the problems, the dangers families may face. Undernutrition, because of they compromise diversity. So what can be done? It's not bad to grow cash crops, but we need to ensure that we have located our land wisely, so that at least as we dedicate parts of it to cash crops, then we also have another portion which is set aside for traditional systems.
But clearly, from the research
and again,
that
maybe
was
one
done,
thing, maybe one important thing I think I should mention here is plantations and monocropping are not good for this earth. It's not good for the soil. Anything we grow as a monocrop asks for a lot, especially in terms of nutrients. It exposes the soil. the soil is not protected. We interfere with the soil flora, and we kill the soil.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's not a system I would say is good for the planet.
Yeah.
The traditional system where you grow many crops together, you have legumes in there, you have cover crops like malenge, the creepers, the malenge,
Yeah.
the gourds, some of the creeping cowpeas, and also some of the twining legumes, like some of the climbing beans. If you mix all those together, they are good for the soil. They cover the soil. You have legumes that add nutrients such as nitrates to the soil. You protect the soil flora, and the soil flora improves their soil structure, and also it makes it retains it alive.
Yeah.
So our traditional practices of multi-cropping, I think, are practices that needs to be given a chance and also studied really properly, and promoted if it's possible.
Yeah.
Because
And
they are good for the household. They offer diverse nutrients, diverse diets, and also every part of the year, of course, has something that comes into season, and the household enjoys.
Still on the conversation, Daktari, are there any notable historical events that you would want to share with us listeners?
Yes, yeah. I think you are referring to a story I gave about the scramble for Africa, when many of the European countries were scrambling for a portion of Africa. And of course, when many of the countries realized they may end up fighting, they called for a meeting in Berlin, what we call the Berlin Conference in 1885.
Yeah.
And of course, it's in that meeting when much of Africa was subdivided. And of course, as many of us know, that Kenya was given to Britain.
Yeah.
And also Uganda, and of course, much of the northern corridor along the Nile all the way. And in Southern Africa also, a lot of that was given to Britain. Zambia, what used to be Northern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, what used to be Southern Rhodesia, and Malawi, and South Africa, of course. But then portions of that were given to Portuguese, Portugal, of course, Angola, Mozambique, and Germany took a few.
Yeah.
Tanganyika, and a portion of Cameroon. Cameroon, I mean. And what used to be South West Africa, now Namibia. And of course, when the British moved in, they didn't move in immediately. They gave the mandate to a company to run its affairs as they prepared the building of the railway. And of course, the Italians got Abyssinia. And as I said in my talk, it was not easy to get into Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, because there was already a government there, the emperor. And because it wasn't easy, they had to bring animals, cows, to feed the army that was going to enter into Abyssinia. And when they brought those cows from India, those cows brought along a disease that was not known in Africa, and that African cows were not used to, were not immune to, and that is rinderpest. And when these cows that were introduced by the Italian army in Abyssinia, brought rinderpest. The rinderpest, of course, spread to local cows, and it was like bushfire. It spread west, south, east. Sorry.
Yes, okay.
And of course, Kenya being a neighbor to Ethiopia was one of the countries that were affected a lot. It cleared a good percentage of all the animals pastoralists had. It continued south, and within 2-3 years, it was already in the Cape province of South Africa. So that disease alone made many of the local people very vulnerable. And a few years later, in about 1896, 97, there was short drought and locust, and also some other disease that was introduced, the smallpox. That endangered the people even more. But now, what endangered the people more is the drought that came at about the same time, and found the people without animals, because animals were what most of the local people could run to in case of shortage of rain. Of course, when there is shortage of rain, people used to move to wetter areas, even if it's 100, 200 kilometers away. So when this situation presented itself like this, smallpox, drought, no animals, then many of the people died.
Yeah.
And it's estimated that like 50% of the Maasai just died out of this. And 25% of the Kambas also died out of this. And that's attributed to, according to many studies, attributed to the fact that they lacked their main source of food, that was animals.
And this was before the British came to settle in
Much
Kenya.
of that had cleared. Yes. So anyway, those are some of the things that came as a result of colonialism. But a lot of that continued because that was about the time when colonialism was taking root. So after that, of course, we get into the 20th century, and the railway has been built, what we used to call the Kenya-Uganda Railway. Of course, it was going as far as Kisumu at that time.
Yeah.
Kisumu was part of Uganda at that time. It was known as St. Florence. So when the railway passed in 1905, now that the railway had been built and Nairobi has been chosen as the headquarters of the colonial government, in 1905, now the settlers were invited to come into the country. And of course, when settlers were invited to come from New Zealand, from South Africa, from Australia, from Europe, and especially Britain, they had to be allocated land. And much of that land, of course, that were allocated to them were lands, areas that were originally occupied by local people. So they had to push people out.
Yeah.
And concentrate them in small places, small areas, so that they could create land for the settlers from around 1905. And of course, that also made the local people even more vulnerable, because of course, when you are concentrated in one area, the result is that there is soil erosion because of overcrowding. You cannot raise more animals now. You can only rear a few cows. The land is small. You cannot farm big lands. And again, that put a lot of stress to local people. I always joke to people, they just go to a place known as Mutituni, just near Machakos, a little bit west of Machakos. That is one of the most densely populated parts in Machakos, really densely populated. And that's where you find most poverty in the county. Most poverty, the most impoverished people, because they're so concentrated. Where did they come from? They came from the areas that were given to colonial settlers, Mua Hills, and all those plains that to the south and north and west of Mua. And so they were all huddled there, pushed there. And even today, it's the place where you find all sorts of poor people, and it's the same place where that school Changoli was burned. I won't be surprised. It's the same stress, because you find when people are desperate, they turn into drinking and also abuse of substances. So some of those colonial sort of activities or interferences are still being felt even today.
Dr. Maingi, besides
the problem, just to say one more thing, the problem is after independence, people didn't bother to turn these lands to their original owners. Many of those large tracts of land were taken by politicians, and they were never returned to the original owners. And that's really unfortunate.
Darius, just hold on. We're still coming back to you. Dr. Maundu, I know you talked about the different crops that were introduced even before colonization, but do we have any other food crops that you would like to share with our listeners that were really introduced during the colonial period?
There are a few others that, when colonialism started, of course, a few other crops were introduced at that time, and a very good example is the waru. They had to cultivate waru in the country. Of course, now waru, or what we call the potato, or sometimes Irish or English potato, is one of the most important crops in central province or central area.
Actually,
the country. And it's become one of the main foodstuffs of the central part of the country. Waru, strictly speaking, is in a category that we call high glycemic index foods. That means waru, the starch gets converted to sugar very quickly. Meaning, if it's converted into sugar very quickly, you eat waru, and within a few hours or a couple of minutes, it's converted into sugar. It shoots your sugar level, and those are some of the foods that are not good for diabetic people and can trigger diabetes. Diabetes now is a major problem in the area, in the central part of the country. I'm not attributing the upsurge to this, but it could be, and I strongly feel waru being a high glycemic index food, it should be investigated. Then, of course, other things that, of course, were introduced. Maize has been here for long. Maize actually was introduced in the country, perhaps from India, but in India it had been introduced by the Portuguese. And the maize that we had originally, and which we grew for a very long time, and we developed our own cultivars, which are resistant to, to adverse weather in our respective cultures, was the one which has blue, black, red, purple colors, the multicolored type of maize, which is packed with good starch. The glycemic index is much less than what we are now consuming, the white one. In terms of nutrition, that was nutritionally more superior than what we are eating now. And again, because of that attitude that was left in our minds, we don't like it because it's white. Because it's the unga is not white. We prefer that what is white. So it's not a preferred type of starch, source of starch, because of that color. Because even the ugali made from that is also a little bit colored. And so the people here is a situation. People living what is theirs, more nutritious, and going for something which they have to buy every now and then. The white type, especially the hybrids that have come recently. I'm not saying those are bad, but what I'm saying is as we grow commercial maize, let's also consider those traditional types. We shouldn't let them disappear. Which are nutritionally, and even in terms of if you roast them, they are sweeter. Those ones are sweeter than the more commercialized types.
Yeah. And also just maybe to take you back there, you're still on the cultural aspect. It's quite interesting to see how Mombasa, in as much as all this has been happening in our food and basically on our plates, are there any communities who have also showcased resilience in preserving their traditional culinary practices? We can also learn so much from India, actually, because there's a part of India.
It's I think one of those aspects that we need to take into account about our food experiences, it's that it's never neat. In fact, there's a bit of a fluidity even in the definition of what's traditional. Because how far back should we go to say this is authentic Kenyan food if, part of maize, was here for 500 years ago, and some of our communities have been here for 200 years, then how far back is indigenous or authentic or traditional food? But then, this is part of, the fluidity that is human interactions. Even within the coastal experience, you have the Italians who are there.
Oh, yeah.
You had the Chinese at the Kenyan coast 400 years ago. You had, all the Zanzibaris in there. So it's a mashup of all these communities and the communal interactions that produces certain foods. I think the build up to that is always how well can we adapt this food to our everyday experiences and the purposes that food serves in the community, whether it's in terms of diversity, whether it's in terms of variety, whether it's in terms of, how much identity do we tie to this, in terms of our capacity to produce it locally and to be able to do that sustainably over generations and to come up with recipes that then we can even pass down communities. So there's that aspect of, like the coastal food experience. You do Malindi, it's, there's the Italian experience there since 1960, and you have all those, Italian sort of, culinaries there that some of them would pass to some varying degree, a sense of authenticity. And it becomes part of the Kenyan coastal experience because there are second, third generation Kenyan Italians there. So there's an aspect to, the whole fights between Lamu and Pate that happens for hundreds of years, introduced a whole bunch of, foods in there with them.
Yeah.
And it becomes as authentic as anything you could call Kenyan. And that's that part of the complexity and the fluidity in terms of deciding what then in the whole experience of history do we decide to make ours and own it and even customize it, if we can, to make it our true experience with food.
So, Darius, what you're trying to say is that we don't really need to decolonize our plates, but rather embrace what's with us.
We do need to decolonize. Definitely we do, because some of the experiences that brought some of the foods that we have here and the models built around them are, if I may use this word, drastic, violent.
Like even on the tea farms, on the coffee farms, the stories that you hear.
Yeah, it's both economic war in there in terms of having certain foods here, both in terms of how they were introduced and the systems built behind them to ensure that they, stay a constant part of our food experience was not pleasant. It came at the cost of losing certain facets of our everyday experiences. It continues to perpetuate certain class and, problematic dynamics around that in terms of affordability of some of these foods, their distribution, who gets to control them. I mean, when you look at maize and you realize we have barely less than 10 millers in control of the entire supply chain, that's a national security issue. When you think about it, it's essentially food as a national security issue. And that happens, we know about the coffee experience. What happens to the local markets, what happens to the international markets. Same conversation with tea, our tea here, all the politics around our tea auction. We know what happened to pyrethrum farming. So, in a sense...
Perhaps, Darius, you could share more on what happened really to the pyrethrum farming. To our listeners who really don't know what really happened.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of, the whole politics around, the production, how it shaped the communities. And, I mean, just reflecting back on, the pyrethrum board and, the work they were doing within communities and how many of the farmers' experiences felt that it was not delivering. And it goes back to the conversation initially we had about cash crops, which is you have all these farmers to whom, you're getting rid of certain farming systems and crops that you had in order to be able to farm these. But then, there's conversations around, misuse of funds, management and governance issues around, the extension services that were around it. And a lot of farmers figured this is not, in a way, able to provide us with sustainable income. Also, number two, it takes away from a lot from our ability to produce for the communities around us. And so, in a sense, they got rid of it, but it had already come at a cost to the farmers and the communities in actually ways that some of the communities haven't, if you can say, fully recovered from that experience. So, and that's just one crop. You have all these tons and dozens of crops whose experience, its introduction, its sustainability, and the systems built behind it definitely need to be decolonized.
Perfect. I like your answer. Yeah. And I think as we wrap up, Darius, because you're coming to the end of the show, and I know also Maundu has a lot to say. So how can individuals and policymakers collaborate to ensure the preservation of traditional knowledge and also decolonizing our plates, food diversity, and sustainable food systems?
The first thing is going back to where we started, understanding that your plate is political. I mean, it's the starting point of everything, that your plate is political, your plate is cultural. Then the conversation becomes, what's political about what's on my plate? How does these crops get here? How is it sustainable in terms of our production? Our communities are growing. I mean, we are a country where, our population grows by close to 1 million, every year, which means food demands are increasing, and they will be increasing year on year, for the better part of the decade or 2 decades, in as much as there are regions that are having a decline in population, we need to have conversations about what does political mean, in terms of the market efficiencies in the system, the entire production and supply chain in terms of where the seeds sourced, what conversations are we having about seeds, and we know there's a 2015 the act. Right now we are having proposals that to outlaw use of traditional manure. Who's driving that conversation? Why are they driving that conversation? What happens to farmers, if they lose the ability to share seeds, which is a very interesting tradition. And it's one of the proposals that's floating around. Hopefully it doesn't go into law. But then what does it mean when you want to outlaw use of traditional manure, which is part of, the most readily available chip within communities?
I'm just curious, when was it shared? Is it available on publicly?
Yes, it is available publicly. It's an ongoing conversation. There's a lot of it on the interwebs. It hasn't been passed into law, but it's definitely, you can tell there are special interest groups trying to get that into, But what do we stand to lose? A lot of our farmers do not have the kind of incomes to be able to buy, fertilizers. So
and how sustainable is it? Because, of course, manure is more sustainable in comparison to...
It is more sustainable. Yeah. It is from the farm. It is part of, the farm practices.
Yeah.
So you are taking that away both as, a very convenient way of, farmers being able to, to work on their yields. But then you also realize that's part of how your plate becomes political, because if it passes, and hopefully not, what do we stand to lose? What will be the farmers' reaction to their inability to, not use this manure, but also not be able to financially afford, whatever now the special interest groups will be offering in terms of all that artificial fertilizer? What happens to the farmers' yields?
Yeah. Asante sana, Darius. Dr. Maundu, as we wrap up the conversation, perhaps you can share with us the role of food in shaping identity and basically in building a sustainable future for Kenya, and in what ways can embracing indigenous foods and culinary traditions contribute to a sustainable food system?
I think we are still a long way to go to sort of have foods that can be called Kenyan foods or a Kenyan cuisine.
Yeah.
Because a Kenyan cuisine at the moment, we have ugali, and the ugali we have is not the original ugali.
Yeah.
Kenyan ugali, according to me, should be made not from maize, but from finger millet or sorghum, which is brown, but very healthy and very tasty. I've done some few experiments. You ask hotels, for example, when you're at a conference, to prepare the two, the white one and the brown one. People go for the brown.
Yeah.
People go for the brown one. It's tastier, and it's tastier, and it's more nutritious because people are now health conscious.
Yeah.
Sorry. So if we are to talk about Kenyan cuisine, those are the sort of considerations we have to make. We have to go for ugali, not from maize, but from those other more traditional stuff, pearl millet, finger millet, sorghum. That would be a genuine Kenyan cuisine, but not the white ugali, which is actually not really healthy because much of the important stuff has been removed in the factory.
Yeah.
So that would be that. And then in terms of Kenyans, like, of course, eating ugali with vegetables, there are lots of vegetables.
Yes.
And these communities have their own vegetables. Let us bring those many types of vegetables into the market so that we can enjoy them. So that the Kenyan cuisine, part of the Kenyan cuisine, can be those traditional vegetables and that brown ugali.
Yeah.
Increasingly, we are eating chapati. Many visitors come to Kenya, they go for chapati, but chapati is originally from Asia. It's only that chapati, the Kenyan chapati, has a lot of oil in it.
Yeah.
But it's an Asian, originally it's an Asian dish. So chapati can also be made in a traditional fashion. Like if you can include some of those traditional sources of starch, like malenge, add a little bit of malenge, or some of those root crops like sweet potato and cassava. You can make a sort of a near Kenyan dish from those. But the way it is right now, chapati is spreading like bushfire into every corner of this country. even in rural areas, they are eating chapati. And it's not a healthy food because it's calories, it's a lot of fat in it.
Yeah.
And it's going to, if people increase their consumption of chapati, and then we are likely to see the effects in terms of obesity, heart diseases, non-communicable diseases in general, including diabetes. Those are things that are likely to come because of consumption of those starchy foods that are not really nutritious.
Yeah.
Then the other thing which I should also mention is the fact that Kenyan food is very diverse. As I said, my last talk, we have over 200 types of vegetables. We have lots of legumes. We have lots of other cereals, as I mentioned. We have roots that also can be used to develop Kenyan dishes. And that, I think, is the direction I would love to see. Dishes that are diverse and dishes that are more nutritious. Because if we diversify, it's better for our society.
Yeah.
Other than just concentrating on a few sources of a few foods that are not healthy for us. And just to mention, I mentioned about glycemic index, but maybe the term may be new to many people.
Yes, actually.
Glycemic index is a measure of how fast, when you eat a meal or a food, how fast it is absorbed and changed as sugar in your blood system. Because of course, if you eat starchy food like ugali, it is immediately worked on by enzymes, and the result is sugar, which is now absorbed into your bloodstream, and of course that raises your blood sugar. So a food that has high glycemic index, like the white bread many Kenyans like, has a very high glycemic index. That means it pushes the blood sugar level very fast and very high. That white bread, that white rice people like so much, those are foods. That waru, those are foods that have really, really high glycemic index. But many of the local cereals, like the millets and the cassava flour, the sweet potatoes, their glycemic index is much lower. And that's why local people, when they are given this, they eat this, they say they can continue farming for the whole day without having to go for lunch. Because their sugar is released slowly by slowly. It's not released at once. And that also protects us from these diseases we are talking about. So that's why we are advocating for some of these local foods, because many of them have health benefits.
Dr. Maundu, do you have any closing remarks? Not necessarily closing remarks, but rather, do you have any call to action that you would love to share with our listeners today?
Maybe the sort of last word I would like to mention is just to encourage listeners to be conscious of the fact that our minds have that attitude, have been influenced in one way or another. And you can see that in every aspect of our life. Even when you see, I'm sorry to say this, but women dying, bleaching their skins, it's still part of that, what I call kasumba. When you see our local institutions just ignoring traditional foods in their menus, and even looking down upon many of the foods that local people offer. For example, many of institutions serve cabbage. Cabbage is not nutritious at all.
Yeah,
If you compare the profile of cabbage and some of the local traditional vegetables, there's no comparison whatsoever. But still, people go for cabbage because of that attitude. It goes from food to dressing to every single aspect of life. So what I would encourage people to do is to be conscious of that fact.
Yeah.
Even when they are buying something in the supermarket, let's be conscious of that fact. Even many times when I go to restaurants, especially in conferences, I interact with the waiters and I ask them, why are you serving this? And the answer is the same, because I found, I was instructed to do.
Yeah.
So it's something that has been going on and on. And unless we are conscious of that fact, then this will drag on and on. So what I would say is, let's be conscious of that fact and let's promote what used to be traditional. Thank you.
Darius, I think I just need you to take you back on basically how can me as Feli basically, or you as Darius, and also our policeman, how can we then collaborate to ensure that we do preserve? You've already talked about this knowledge that this traditional knowledge specifically on the manure, but the government has introduced a proposal. But how then do we ensure we do collaborate to ensure that there's preservation of this knowledge that we have? There's also food diversity. Yeah.
For me, it's one, let's say, right. Put it on paper, Let's document as much of our food experiences as we can, our traditional practices. There's this conversation that's always said about, this lady who, every time she wanted to cook yams, she would chop both sides and then she would put on a plate and then, essentially prepare it. And her husband asked, why do you do that? She said, I don't know. My mom used to do it. I said, next time when we go see mom, we'll ask her. Then they asked the mom. The mom said, oh, yeah, I do that because my mother used to do it. And then they say, okay, we'll ask grandma. Then when they went to ask grandma, she said, oh, yeah, back then my sufuria, my pans used to be small. So I had to chop the yams on the side to fit in the sufuria.
Oh, okay.
It's part of how, these stories, you always want to ask, why do we do X? Why do we do Y?
Yeah.
And can we document this such that, in a way you can always look back. It's always easier for people to access it. And we have, digital media, blogs, we have vloggers, we have food fairs, we need to create as much and document as much of our food experiences as we possibly can. At a personal level, at research level, at, experiential level, and use all the multimedia platforms that are there, because once it goes on record, then it becomes easier for others to, either authenticate it, add to it, correct some of the things, on the account that's given about some of these foods. So for me, the big part is document. And it's part of why we at The Elephant, we've done year-on-year collaborations with Root to Food, because then it allows us to be able to put this on record. People are able to say, aha, now I understand why this happens to maize, or this happens to bananas, this happens to, macadamia or whatever other crop out there. I'm big on documenting. We are big on documenting. Number one. Number two, as I said, beginning to understand that food is political and asking what are these actual political experiences around our food. We've talked about legislations, whether it's on seeds, whether it's on manure, whether it's on yields, whether it's on, farm prices of foods and market prices of foods. So it's important to look at it on that angle. It's important to talk about the cultural aspects of it. So for me, it's big on conversations, number one. Number two, documentation. Number three, I would say, is generating new, information around it. And especially, so for example, when you talk about, I'll go back to the brew conversation. Almost every country in the world has their particular brands. They say, Ecuadorians will say, for us it's rum, the French will say it's wines. But then you realize that one of the experiences we Kenyans have that is very British is the fact that we do not have a particular,
Yeah.
brand of whether it's wine or vodka or rum or whiskey or as part of your national identity. It's always the funny part about the fact that when you go abroad, so say it's the Euros or Olympics, people tend not to like the British, because the funny experience is people say they drink everything that they'll find there. The French will order theirs. The Canadians know what they're ordering. And the British will be like, what's available? Which is also a very Kenyan experience considering we were the settler colony. I mean, when you look at that kind of a thing, you realize we inherited this experience that we've never questioned. And I mean, I would understand. I mean, I know the vice president is talking about, the war on alcohol in central Kenya. But what's interesting is you look at the available data, it will tell you that we really do not have a particular, drinking problem, as he puts it, or at least not in the way he frames it. And part of the problem is that because we do not have a particular culture in terms of whether people want to take their wines or their rums or their vodka, the people drink everything. And so what would pass for, particular, brews that we decide our national experience, then it becomes easier to ask how does that fit into, a particular drinking culture. Then it becomes easier to access that. Now, think of that as just one problem.
Yeah. Something
we inherited from, our colonial experience, and it creates fun implications within community. Like, who decides, who's, when is this drinking a problem?
Yeah.
It's also a classed conversation, because we decide, if I walk into, Windsor and order wine now, I'm okay. But if some guy here goes to a local right now and grabs a white cup, he has a problem.
Yeah.
There's a classed dynamic to it. And you see all these experiences, we've never gone back and asked, why?
Yeah, it's quite interesting how the conversation has moved to now. But I feel like we need to censor here and say that it's not that we encourage people to drink alcohol, but it's just that we couldn't avoid it talking about colonization and food. I feel like that's a discussion we couldn't avoid. Yeah.
Cut that part out.
No, I think you can just say some of it can just fly. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Darius. Do you have any punching statements as you wrap up the show?
For me, it's going back to what we've just talked about, documenting. Putting resources behind being able to chronicle our food experiences in such a way. I mean, if you look online right now, on Twitter, there's a lot of fights between, Kenyans and Nigerians and Ghanaians and, about who has a better urban street food experience, who has, which are always interesting conversations because you don't want them to go away. But it also gives you sort of small insights into how, for example, Kenyans will feel about Nigerian street foods, Nigerians feel about Kenyan street foods, Kenyans feel about Malawian or South African street foods. And for me, I look at that as part of the documentation of our food experiences. Of course, there are varied ways to go about, that food documentation. But I think the conversation should continue in all these possible spaces and in every other platform where we can be able to create collaboration, whether it's between the states and, academia, researchers, and, people within the new media platforms, vloggers, especially food vloggers, food fairs, and across the continuum. Keep the conversations going, keep these accounts coming, document.
Thank you so much, Darius, and thank you so much, Dr. Maundu, for joining us. Asanteni sana to our listeners for listening in. We really appreciate your support. Follow us on social media at True to Food on Twitter, at True to Food on Facebook, and at True to Food on Instagram. And you can also check out our website, www.truetofood, to learn more on the work that we do. And you can also check out The Elephant. I'll share the link on the show notes, specifically on the food series, where you'll be able to learn more on some of the work that we have been doing. This episode has been recorded by Creatives Garage. Creatives Garage is a multidisciplinary arts organization that provides a platform for creatives network, share ideas, collaborate, create new works, gain market access, and push boundaries. Thank you so much for listening in.